He was a single father working 3 jobs just to keep the lights on when the phone rang at 2:17 a.m. Most people would have let it go to voicemail, especially when the caller hung up after just saying an address. But Trevor Stone wasn't most people. He grabbed his truck keys, left his sleeping son with a note, and drove through the worst storm Thornfield had seen all year to help a complete stranger. He had no idea that the woman trapped in that overturned luxury car was worth more than his entire neighborhood combined, or that she was running from a life that was slowly killing her soul. What started as a wrong number became the right choice that would change 3 lives forever. Quick pause before we continue. Tell us, where in the world are you watching from? If you're enjoying these stories, make sure to hit subscribe because tomorrow's episode is absolutely mind-blowing. The rain hammered against the windows of the small duplex on Maple Street like bullets against glass, each drop carrying the weight of a Pennsylvania winter that refused to let go. Trevor Stone stood at the kitchen sink, his hands submerged in lukewarm dishwater that had long since lost its soap, scrubbing at a plate that had seen better days 3 years ago. The digital clock on the microwave blinked 2:15 a.m. in angry red. Numbers, a constant reminder that he should have been asleep hours ago, but sleep was a luxury Trevor couldn't afford. Not when the stack of bills on the counter seemed to grow taller each day. Not when his 8-year-old son Aiden needed new school supplies. And certainly not when the ancient furnace in the basement had started making that grinding sound again. The sound that meant another repair bill he couldn't pay. He dried the last fork with a threadbare dish towel and glanced toward the narrow hallway where Aiden slept. Through the crack under his bedroom door, Trevor could see the soft glow of the nightlight, shaped like a rocket ship. Aiden insisted on having it every night, along with exactly 3 stuffed animals arranged in a specific order on his pillow. The routine never varied. For a child with autism, predictability wasn't just comfort, it was survival. Trevor had learned that lesson the hard way 2 years ago when Hannah died. His wife had been the one who understood Aiden's needs instinctively, who could calm his meltdowns with a whispered song or redirect his fixations with patient creativity. Trevor was still learning, still making mistakes, still feeling like he was failing more often than succeeding. The phone rang, sharp and jarring in the silence. Trevor stared at the ancient cordless handset on the counter. Its plastic yellowed, with age, and its antenna held on with electrical tape. Nobody called at 2:17 a.m. with good news. Nobody called at this hour unless someone was dead, dying, or in jail. His heart hammered against his ribs as he reached for the phone, expecting to see Mrs. Medina's number. His elderly neighbor sometimes had medical emergencies, and Trevor was the closest thing to family she had, but the display showed only unknown caller. He almost let it go to voicemail, almost. But something in the persistence of the ringing, the way it seemed to cut through the storm like a cry for help, made him answer. "Hello?" Static crackled through the line, followed by a woman's voice, breathless and panicked. "Please, I need help. 1847 Riverside Drive. The car is... I can't..." The line went dead. Trevor stared at the phone, his mind racing. Riverside Drive was on the other side of town, winding through the hills, where the old money families had built their estates decades ago. He'd only been there once, delivering auto parts to one of the mansions when he'd worked at Patterson's garage. The houses sat behind iron gates and manicured hedges, worlds away from his cramped duplex and overdue notices. He could call the police. Should call the police. Let them handle whatever emergency was happening in the wealthy part of town. He had his own problems, his own responsibilities. Aiden would wake up in 4 hours for school, and Trevor had to be at the loading dock by 6. But the woman's voice echoed in his mind. The fear in it was real, raw, unmistakable, and Trevor Stone had never been able to ignore someone who needed help, even when helping meant sacrificing what little he had. He grabbed a piece of paper, from the junk drawer and scrawled a quick note. Aiden, had to help someone, back soon. Mrs. Medina has my number if you need anything. Love, Dad. He left it on the kitchen table where his son would see it if he woke up, though Aiden rarely stirred before his alarm. The garage behind the duplex was barely large enough for his 15-year-old pickup truck, and the overhead door protested, with a screech of rusted metal as he raised it. Rain immediately soaked through his work jacket as he climbed into the cab. The engine turned over reluctantly, coughing like an old man with pneumonia before settling into its familiar rough idle. Riverside Drive stretched before him like a tunnel through the storm. The windshield wipers, one of them missing half its rubber blade, struggled against the downpour. Streetlights became fuzzy orbs in the darkness, and twice Trevor had to slow to a crawl when the road disappeared entirely behind sheets of rain. The houses along Riverside were dark, their windows like dead eyes staring out at the storm. Massive. Oaks lined the street, their branches reaching across the asphalt like gnarled fingers. Trevor squinted at the mailboxes, trying to make out numbers in the gloom. 1823, 1835, 1841. He almost missed it. 1847 sat at the end of a long driveway, partially hidden behind a stone pillar that had seen better days. But there was no house visible from the road, just the dark mouth of a drive that curved up into the hills. And at the entrance, skid marks, painted black streaks across the wet asphalt. Trevor pulled over and grabbed the flashlight from his glove compartment. The beam was weak, the batteries dying, but it was enough to follow the skid marks down the embankment on the far side of the road. His boots slipped on the wet grass as he made his way down the slope, and the sound of his breathing seemed unnaturally loud in the storm. The luxury sedan was on its side, half hidden in a grove of pine trees about 30 feet from the road. Steam rose from the crumpled hood, and the smell of antifreeze and gasoline hung heavy in the air. The car had rolled at least twice, judging by the damage, and it was a miracle it hadn't caught fire. "Hello?" Trevor called out, his voice swallowed by the wind. "Can you hear me?" A weak response came from inside the car, muffled and barely audible. Trevor scrambled down the remaining slope, his flashlight beam dancing over twisted metal and shattered glass. The driver's side window had been completely destroyed, leaving a jagged opening just large enough for a person to crawl through. He knelt beside the wreckage and shined his light inside. A woman hung suspended by her seatbelt, her long dark hair hanging like a curtain around her face. Blood trickled from a cut on her forehead, but her eyes were open and alert. She wore what looked like an expensive silk dress, now torn and stained, and diamonds glittered at her throat despite the circumstances. "Are you hurt?" Trevor asked, trying to keep his voice calm and steady. She turned her head toward him, wincing at the movement. I think my shoulder is dislocated, and my leg is pinned under something. Don't try to move. I'm going to call for help." "No." The word came out sharp, desperate. "Please, no ambulance, no police. They can't know I was here." Trevor frowned. "Ma'am, you need medical attention. This is serious." "I know how it looks, but please." Her voice cracked with emotion that went deeper than physical pain. "I'll pay you, whatever you want. Just help me get out of here quietly." For a moment, Trevor just stared at her. Everything about the situation screamed danger. A wealthy woman in an expensive car, begging him not to call the authorities, offering him money. It could be drugs, could be she was running from something illegal, could be a dozen different kinds of trouble he couldn't afford to get involved in. But when he looked into her eyes, what he saw wasn't guilt or calculation. It was the same desperate fear he'd heard in her voice on the phone. The fear of someone who was running from something maybe, but not from justice. From something else entirely. "What's your name?" he asked softly. "Serafina," she whispered. "Serafina Vanderbilt." The name hit Trevor like a physical blow. Vanderbilt, as in Vanderbilt Industries, the manufacturing company that employed half of Thornfield and owned the other half. As in the family whose charitable foundation had a wing at the hospital, whose name was on the library and the community center. As in money that stretched back generations, influence that reached into every corner of the state. "Okay, Serafina," he said, surprised by how steady his own voice sounded. "We're going to get you out of there, but I need you to trust me, and I need you to stay calm." He spent the next 20 minutes carefully working to free her from the wreckage. The passenger side door was jammed, but he managed to pry it open with a tire iron from his truck. Her shoulder was definitely dislocated, and her left leg was trapped under the collapsed dashboard, but nothing seemed to be broken. When he finally helped her climb out of the car, she collapsed against him, trembling from shock and cold. She was smaller than she'd seemed in the car, delicate in a way that made Trevor think of expensive china, but there was steel underneath the fragility, a core of strength that had kept her conscious and alert through what should have been a fatal accident. "Can you walk?" he asked. "I think so." She took a tentative step and nearly fell. Trevor caught her, one arm around her waist, and felt her lean into him with unconscious trust. "Let me help you to my truck. We'll figure out what to do from there." As they made their way slowly up the embankment, Serafina spoke quietly, her voice barely audible over the storm. "You didn't have to come. Most people wouldn't have." "Most people aren't me," Trevor replied simply. "Why did you? Come, I mean. You don't know me." Trevor was quiet for a moment, thinking about Aidan sleeping peacefully in his rocket ship nightlight glow, about Hannah and the way she'd always stop to help strangers, about the kind of man he wanted to be for his son. "Because someone asked for help," he said finally, "and I've been in places where I needed help too." They reached his truck just as the storm began to ease, the rain shifting from a downpour to a steady patter. In the weak dome light, Trevor got his first clear look at the woman he'd just rescued. Even disheveled and bleeding, even wearing a torn dress and no shoes, Serafina Vanderbilt was stunning. But more than that, she looked lost in a way that had nothing to do with being stranded on the side of the road. "Where do you want me to take you?" he asked as he helped her into the passenger seat. She was quiet for so long that he thought she might not answer. Finally, she looked at him with eyes that held depths of pain he couldn't begin to understand. "I don't know," she whispered. "I honestly don't know." Telling and preparing this story took us a lot of time. So if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. The heater in Trevor's truck wheezed like an old accordion, pushing out lukewarm air that barely cut through the chill. Serafina sat hunched in the passenger seat, her arms wrapped around herself, staring out at the rain-slick streets of Thornfield as if seeing them for the first time. Blood had dried on her forehead in a thin line, and her expensive dress clung to her in damp patches that spoke of wealth meeting harsh reality. Trevor glanced at her as he navigated the empty streets, his mind racing through options. The hospital was out of the question since she'd specifically refused medical attention. A hotel would ask questions, require identification, leave a paper trail that she seemed desperate to avoid. That left his duplex, which felt presumptuous at best and dangerous at worst. But as the minutes ticked by and she remained silent, lost in whatever internal storm had brought her to this moment, he realized she truly had nowhere else to go. "There's a 24-hour diner on Main Street," he said finally, his voice careful and neutral. "We could get you cleaned up, maybe some coffee, help you figure out your next move." Serafina turned toward him, and in the intermittent glow of the streetlights, he could see tears threatening at the corners of her eyes. "You've already done enough. More than enough. I shouldn't have called that number, shouldn't have dragged you into whatever this is." "What is this?" Trevor asked gently. I mean, you don't have to tell me everything, but if I'm going to help, I should know what we're dealing with." She was quiet for a long moment, her fingers fidgeting with the remnants of what had once been an elegant bracelet. "My mother wants me to marry a man I've never loved, tomorrow. Well, today, technically, since it's already past midnight." The words hung in the air between them, simple and devastating. Trevor had expected drugs, maybe embezzlement, some kind of criminal activity. That would explain the secrecy. Instead, it was something far more personal and, in some ways, more tragic. "Arranged marriage?" he asked, trying to keep the surprise out of his voice. "Business merger disguised as love," Serafina replied bitterly. "Sebastian Drake owns 3 companies that complement our manufacturing interests. The marriage would consolidate holdings, eliminate competition, ensure the Vanderbilt name continues to dominate the regional economy for another generation." "And you don't want that," she laughed. But there was no humor in it. "What I want has never been particularly relevant to Vanderbilt Industries' long-term strategic planning." Trevor pulled into the parking lot of Mel's Diner, a chrome and neon relic from the 1950s that served as Thornfield's unofficial late-night confessional. Through the windows, he could see a lone waitress reading a paperback novel behind the counter and a trucker hunched over a cup of coffee in a corner booth. "Look," Trevor said, turning off the engine but making no move to get out. "I don't know much about your world, but I know something about being trapped. After my wife died, everyone had opinions about what I should do, how I should raise Aiden, what kind of life I should build. Most of it was well-meaning, but none of it felt like mine." Serafina studied his face in the dim light. "How did you get past it? I stopped listening to everyone else and started listening to myself, started asking what would make Aiden happy, what would make me happy, instead of what would make everyone else comfortable, even when it meant disappointing people." "Especially then," Trevor said. "The people who love you want you to be happy. The people who don't love you want you to be useful. The trick is figuring out which category everyone falls into." They sat in comfortable silence for a moment, the rain drumming softly on the roof of the truck. Finally, Serafina reached for the door handle. "Coffee sounds good," she said, "and maybe you could tell me about your son." The diner was warm and bright, filled with the comforting smells of coffee and bacon grease. The waitress, a woman in her 60s with kind eyes and graying hair pulled back in a practical ponytail, looked up from her book as they entered. Her gaze took in Serafina's torn dress and Trevor's work clothes with the practiced neutrality of someone who'd worked late-night shifts for decades. "Coffee for 2?" she asked, already reaching for the pot. "Please," Trevor said, guiding Serafina to a booth in the back corner, away from the windows. As they settled into the cracked vinyl seats, the waitress appeared with 2 steaming mugs and a small first aid kit. She set the kit down beside Serafina without comment, then disappeared back behind the counter. "Small towns," Trevor said with a slight smile. "Everyone minds their own business, but they also take care of their own." Serafina opened the kit and found antiseptic wipes and butterfly bandages. Her hands shook slightly as she cleaned the cut on her forehead, and Trevor noticed her shoulder was still sitting wrong, clearly dislocated, but not severely. "I should look at that shoulder," he said. "You know about medical things? Army medic training about 1,000,000 years ago. Plus, Aiden's had his share of playground injuries. I'm not a doctor, but I can reset a simple dislocation." She nodded, and Trevor moved to her side of the booth. His hands were gentle but confident as he examined her shoulder, and she found herself relaxing under his touch, despite the circumstances. "This is going to hurt," he warned, positioning his hands carefully. "Nothing hurts worse than the last 2 years of my life," she said, closing her eyes. The pop was audible as her shoulder slipped back into place. Serafina gasped, her eyes watering, but the relief was immediate. She rolled her shoulder experimentally, wincing but grateful. "Better?" Trevor asked, returning to his side of the booth. Much. Thank you. She sipped her coffee, savoring the warmth and the normalcy of it. Tell me about Aiden. Trevor's face transformed when he spoke about his son. The lines of exhaustion and worry softened, replaced by pride and love that was unmistakable. He told her about Aiden's fascination with space, his ability to remember every detail about rockets and planets and distant stars, about his struggles. In school, not because he wasn't smart enough, but because the world was often too loud, too chaotic, too unpredictable for his sensitive nature. He sounds extraordinary, Serafina said when Trevor paused. He is, but raising him alone. Trevor trailed off, staring into his coffee. Some days, I feel like I'm failing him, like he needs more than I can give. What kind of more? Stability. A real home, instead of a rented duplex with neighbors who complain about his meltdowns, educational opportunities, therapy sessions I can actually afford. Trevor's voice carried the weight of 2 years of accumulated worry. I work 3 jobs, and we're still barely making it. Last month I had to choose between his speech therapy and the electric bill. Serafina felt something twist in her chest. A recognition of pain that transcended their vastly different circumstances. What did you choose? Speech therapy. We ate dinner by candlelight for a week and told him we were camping indoors. The simple statement hit Serafina like a physical blow. Here was a man who would sacrifice his own comfort, his own basic needs for his child's development. She thought about her own childhood, surrounded by every material advantage money could buy, but starved for the kind of love and attention Trevor gave his son without even thinking about it. You're not failing him, she said quietly. You're teaching him what love looks like. Trevor met her eyes across the table, and something passed between them, an understanding that went deeper than their brief acquaintance should have allowed. What about you? He asked. What does your family think love looks like? Serafina's expression darkened. Control, obligation, maintaining appearances. My mother believes love is ensuring the family name survives another generation, regardless of the cost to the people who carry it. And your father died 3 years ago. Heart attack at his desk, working on a merger that would expand our reach. Into 3 new states. Her voice carried old grief mixed with anger. He never saw me graduate college, never walked me down an aisle, never met any grandchildren. But Vanderbilt Industries posted record profits that quarter. Trevor reached across the table and covered her hand with his. His fingers were calloused from years of manual labor, stained with motor oil that never quite washed away completely. Her hands were soft, manicured, decorated with jewelry that cost more than his annual salary. But in that moment, the differences between them felt less important than the similarities. Is that why you ran tonight? He asked. Serafina nodded, tears finally spilling over. The rehearsal dinner was tonight. Tomorrow I was supposed to walk down the aisle and promise to love, honor, and obey a man who sees me as a business asset. Sebastian's not cruel exactly, just empty. We've had maybe 5 real conversations in the 6 months we've been engaged. He knows my net worth better than my favorite color. What is your favorite color? The question was so unexpected, so beautifully normal, that Serafina laughed through her tears. Green, forest green, like the trees behind our estate in spring. Sebastian thinks it's silver, because that's what I wore to the charity gala where he proposed. Green's a good color, Trevor said seriously. Aiden would approve. He says green is the color of growing things. They sat quietly for a while, drinking coffee and watching the rain streak down the windows. The diner felt like a sanctuary, a place outside of time where a billionaire heiress and a struggling single father could exist in the same space without the weight of their different worlds pressing down on them. Finally, Serafina spoke again. I can't go back. Not to the wedding, not to that life, but I don't know how to be anyone else. I've been Serafina Vanderbilt, future Mrs. Sebastian Drake, for so long that I don't remember who I am underneath all of that. Maybe that's something you figure out as you go, Trevor said. Maybe running away tonight was just the first step. And what about the second step? Trevor considered this seriously. The second step is deciding what you want your life to look like. Not what your mother wants. Not what's expected of you, but what would make you happy to wake up to every morning. Serafina stared at him, struck by the radical simplicity of the concept. In her world, happiness was a luxury, a pleasant side effect if all the important obligations were met first. The idea that it could be a goal in itself, something to build, a life around, felt revolutionary. I don't think I know how to do that, she admitted. Then maybe that's something else you figure out as you go, Trevor said with a gentle smile. Outside, the storm was finally beginning to clear, and the first faint hints of dawn touched the eastern sky. In a few hours, Thornfield would wake up to the news that Serafina Vanderbilt had disappeared on the eve of her wedding. But for now, in the warm bubble of Mel's diner, two people who should never have met were discovering that sometimes the most important conversations happen with strangers. The first rays of genuine sunlight were painting the eastern sky pale, gold, when Trevor glanced at his watch and felt his stomach drop. 5:47 a.m. In 13 minutes, his alarm would go off, and Aidan would begin his precisely choreographed morning routine. Shower at exactly 6:15, breakfast at 6:30, backpack check at 6:45, and out the door at 7 cars sharp for the school bus. Any deviation from this schedule could trigger a meltdown that would derail the entire day. I have to get home, Trevor said, the weight of responsibility settling back onto his shoulders like a familiar coat. My son will be waking up soon, and he doesn't handle surprises well. Serafina nodded, understanding flickering in her eyes. Of course, you've already done more than anyone should expect. But as they stood to leave, Trevor found himself hesitating. The morning light streaming through the diner's windows illuminated the exhaustion etched in Serafina's face, the way she held herself like someone who had nowhere left to run. Outside, Thornfield was waking up to what should have been her wedding day, and by now her absence had surely been discovered. "Come with me," he said, the words leaving his mouth before his rational mind could stop them. Serafina blinked in surprise. "I couldn't impose on your family. You barely know me." "It's just me and Aidan, and you need somewhere safe to figure out your next move." Trevor ran a hand through his hair, second-guessing himself even as he spoke. "It's not much, but it's quiet, private. No one would think to look for you there." The offer hung between them like a bridge neither was sure they should cross. Trevor's duplex was worlds away from the Vanderbilt estate, a modest working-class home that would fit into her family's garage. But Serafina found herself nodding before she could overthink the implications. "Just for a few hours," she said, "until I can figure out what to do next." The drive to Maple Street took less than 10 minutes, but it felt like traveling between different planets. They left behind the well-maintained streets of downtown Thornfield, with their historic brick facades and carefully tended flower boxes, and entered a neighborhood where chain-link fences bordered small yards, and pickup trucks sat in driveways beside aging sedans. Trevor's duplex was painted a faded blue that had probably been cheerful once, with white trim that needed touching. Up and a small front porch that sagged slightly on one side. The yard was tiny, but meticulously maintained, with a vegetable garden taking up most of the back corner and a wooden swing set that looked homemade. "It's not much," Trevor said as he pulled into the narrow driveway, suddenly seeing his home through the eyes of someone who lived in a mansion. "It's perfect," Serafina said, and she meant it. There was something about the house that spoke of love and care, of a life built with intention rather than inherited obligation. Wind chimes made from painted soup cans hung from the porch ceiling, and children's artwork was visible through the front window, taped to the glass with obvious pride. As they approached the front door, Trevor paused with his key halfway to the lock. Aidan can be intense when he meets new people. He might not talk to you at all, or he might ask you 40 questions about your favorite planet. Just so you know, I understand. I had a cousin with autism. She taught me that different doesn't mean difficult, just different. Trevor's expression softened with relief and something that looked like gratitude. He unlocked the door and they stepped into a living room that was small but immaculately organized. Everything had its place. Books arranged by height on homemade. Shelves, toys sorted into labeled bins, a dozen family photos clustered on the mantelpiece around a larger portrait of a woman with kind eyes and Aidan's smile. "That's Hannah," Trevor said, noticing Serafina's gaze. She would have loved this situation. She always said the universe had a sense of humor about bringing people together. The sound of an alarm clock echoed from down the hallway, followed immediately by the patter of small feet hitting the floor. Serafina watched Trevor transform, his tired features brightening as he prepared for the most important part of his day. "Aidan," he called out. "I'm home, buddy. We have a friend visiting." A few minutes later, a small boy emerged from the hallway, already dressed in jeans and a NASA t-shirt, his dark hair sticking up in several directions despite obvious attempts to comb it down. He stopped when he saw Serafina, his eyes widening with curiosity rather than fear. "Hello," he said formally, as if he'd been practicing the greeting. "I'm Aidan Stone, and I'm 8 years old. My favorite planet is Saturn because it has the most interesting ring system." "Hello, Aidan," Serafina replied, matching his formal tone instinctively. "I'm Serafina, and I think Saturn is an excellent choice. The rings are made of ice and rock particles, aren't they?" Aidan's face lit up like Christmas morning. "Yes, and did you know that Saturn has 82 moons? That's more than any other planet except Jupiter. I didn't know that. How many moons does Jupiter have?" 79 that we've discovered so far, Aidan said, settling onto the couch beside her as if they'd been friends for years. "But scientists think there might be more that are too small to see with our current telescopes." Trevor watched this exchange with amazement. Aidan usually took weeks to warm up to new people, if he warmed up to them at all. But there was something about Serafina's genuine interest, the way she listened to his space facts as if they were the most fascinating things she'd ever heard, that had put him completely at ease. "Dad," Aidan said, suddenly turning to Trevor, "can Serafina stay for breakfast? I want to show her my rocket collection." "If she'd like to," Trevor said, glancing at Serafina questioningly. "I would love to see your rockets," she said, and Aidan beamed. As Aidan disappeared into his room to retrieve his prized collection, Trevor moved into the kitchen to start breakfast. The space was cramped but efficient, with a small table that doubled as workspace and homework station. Serafina followed, drawn by the domestic comfort of watching Trevor crack eggs into a bowl while coffee percolated on the counter. "He's wonderful," she said softly. "He's my whole world," Trevor replied, whisking the eggs with practiced efficiency. "Some days I wonder if I'm giving him enough. But then he has a morning like this, and I remember that love is probably the most important thing I can offer." Through the kitchen window, Serafina could see into the neighboring yards, where other families were beginning their morning routines. A woman hung laundry on a line while her toddler played in a sandbox. An elderly man watered plants on his back porch, waving to Trevor through the glass. It was a world so far removed from her own that it felt almost fictional, yet undeniably real and warm. "Mr. Trevor?" The voice came from the back door, accompanied by a gentle knock. "I saw your truck and wanted to make sure everything was okay." "Come in, Mrs. Medina," Trevor called out. An elderly woman entered through the back door, carrying a covered plate that smelled of fresh tortillas and chorizo. She was small and round, with silver hair pulled back in a neat bun and eyes that missed nothing. Her gaze took in Serafina's torn dress and the butterfly bandage on her forehead with the shrewd assessment of someone who'd seen plenty of life's complications. "I brought extra breakfast," Mrs. Medina said, setting the plate on the counter. "Figured you might be hungry after your late-night adventure." "Mrs. Medina, this is Serafina," Trevor said, managing introductions while flipping eggs in the pan. "Serafina, this is our neighbor, Mrs. Gloria Medina. She keeps us fed and looked after." "Pleased to meet you, dear," Mrs. Medina said, studying Serafina with kind but curious eyes. "That's a nasty cut on your head. You should ice it to keep the swelling down." "Thank you. Trevor already took very good care of me." "Of course he did. That boy couldn't ignore someone in need if his life depended on it." Mrs. Medina bustled around the kitchen with the familiarity of family, retrieving ice from the freezer and wrapping it in a clean dish towel. "Sometimes I think he cares more about other people than he does about himself." Aidan returned with an armload of model rockets, each one carefully painted and assembled. He spread them across the coffee table like a museum display, explaining the specifications of each one to Serafina with the expertise of a junior NASA engineer. She listened with genuine fascination, asking questions that made him think and beam with pride at his knowledge. "This one's my favorite," Aidan said, holding up a particularly impressive model. "It's a scale replica of the Saturn V that took the Apollo astronauts to the moon. Dad helped me build it for my birthday." "It's incredible," Serafina said, examining the detailed craftsmanship. "You could work for NASA someday." "That's my plan," Aidan said seriously. "I want to design rockets that can take people to Mars. Dad says if you work hard and never give up, you can make any dream come true." Serafina glanced at Trevor, who was setting plates on the table with quiet pride written across his features. Here was a man who worked multiple jobs to keep the lights on, who worried about choosing between his son's therapy and basic utilities, yet he still encouraged his child to reach for the stars. The contrast with her own upbringing, where dreams had been secondary to duty and expectations, was startling. As they sat down to breakfast together, Mrs. Medina hovering nearby with the protective affection of a surrogate grandmother, Serafina felt something she hadn't experienced in years, the simple pleasure of belonging somewhere, even temporarily. The eggs were perfectly cooked, the coffee was strong, and the conversation flowed with the easy rhythm of family. But even as she savored this glimpse of normal life, Serafina was aware of the world outside closing in. Her phone, which she'd turned off after the accident, would be buzzing with increasingly frantic messages. Her mother would be coordinating search efforts with the efficiency of a military operation. Sebastian would be pacing in his perfectly appointed study, calculating the financial implications of a runaway bride. The peaceful bubble of Trevor's kitchen couldn't last forever, and as the morning light grew stronger, Serafina knew she was running out of time to decide what kind of life she wanted to build from the ashes of the one she'd left behind. The peace of breakfast was shattered by the sound of Serafina's phone buzzing insistently from inside her torn purse. She'd forgotten she'd turned it back on after they'd arrived at Trevor's house, and now it vibrated against the coffee table like an angry wasp trapped in glass. Aidan looked up from his rocket models with concern, while Trevor's expression grew. "Serious. 17 missed calls," Serafina said, her face paling as she read the display. 12 from Mother, 5 from Sebastian. "You don't have to answer," Trevor said quietly. But they both knew that wasn't really true. The longer she stayed silent, the wider the search would spread, and eventually it would reach even this quiet corner of Thornfield. The phone rang again, Sebastian's name appearing on the screen. Serafina stared at it for a long moment, then looked at Aidan, who was watching with the intense focus he brought to everything that seemed important. "I should take this," she said, standing and moving toward the kitchen for privacy. Trevor could hear only fragments of the conversation through the thin walls, but Sebastian's voice carried clearly even through the phone speaker, tight with barely controlled anger and what sounded like panic. "Where the hell are you, Serafina? The church is booked, the caterer is setting up, and your mother is about to call the police. This is not the time for whatever breakdown you're having." "I'm not having a breakdown, Sebastian. I'm making a choice." "A choice? You've been making choices for months about flowers and music and seating arrangements. The only choice left is whether you're going to honor your commitments or destroy everything our families have worked toward." Aidan had moved closer to Trevor, his small hand finding his father's arm in the way he did when the world felt too loud or unpredictable. Trevor pulled him onto his lap, stroking his hair in a gentle rhythm that usually helped calm his anxiety. "Who's the angry man?" Aidan whispered. "Someone who doesn't understand that people are more important than plans," Trevor replied softly. In the kitchen, Serafina's voice had grown steadier, more determined. "Sebastian, I can't marry you. I'm sorry for the timing, sorry for the embarrassment, but I can't spend my life pretending to love someone I barely know." "Love." Sebastian's laugh was harsh. "This isn't about love, Serafina. This is about responsibility. This is about securing your family's future and honoring your father's vision. Do you think he built Vanderbilt Industries so you could throw it away on romantic fantasies?" "My father is dead," Serafina said, her voice breaking slightly. "He's been dead for 3 years, and I'm tired of living my life according to what he might have wanted instead of what I actually want." The line went quiet for a moment, and when Sebastian spoke again, his tone had shifted from anger to something colder, more calculating. "Fine. You want to play games? We'll play games. But understand that there are consequences, Serafina. Legal consequences, financial consequences. Your little rebellion could cost your family everything." The phone went silent, and Serafina stood in the kitchen, staring at the device in her hand, as if it had transformed into something venomous. Trevor found her there a few minutes later, her shoulders shaking with suppressed emotion. "He's not wrong," she said without looking up. "There are contracts, merger agreements, financial arrangements that depend on this marriage. If I don't go through with it, it could bankrupt the company. Hundreds of people could lose their jobs." "And if you do go through with it?" Trevor asked gently. "Then I lose myself completely." She looked up at him, tears threatening again. "But maybe that's a fair trade. One person's happiness for hundreds of people's livelihoods." Trevor was quiet for a moment, thinking about his own choices, the weight of responsibility he carried for Aidan's future. "When Hannah was dying," he said finally, "she made me promise that I wouldn't sacrifice my life to grief. She said that living a half-life wouldn't honor her memory or help Aidan grow up strong. This is different. This isn't just about me, isn't it?" Trevor moved closer, his voice gentle but firm. "Because from where I'm standing, it looks like someone who's been taught that her own needs don't matter is using other people's welfare as an excuse to stay trapped." Before Serafina could respond, the doorbell rang. Through the front window, Trevor could see a black sedan parked at the curb, its engine still running. A man in an expensive suit stood on the porch, his posture radiating impatience and authority. "That's Harrison Blake," Serafina whispered, recognizing her mother's personal assistant. "Mother sent him to find me." Aidan appeared in the kitchen doorway, his rocket still clutched in his hands. "Dad, there's a man at the door who looks angry. Should I hide?" "Nobody, you stay here with Serafina. I'll handle this." Trevor opened the front door before Harrison could ring the bell again. The man was tall and thin, with silver hair and the kind of manicured appearance that spoke of money and power. His gaze swept past Trevor dismissively, clearly expecting to see past him to Serafina. "I'm here for Miss Vanderbilt," Harrison said without preamble. "There's been a family emergency, and she's needed at home immediately." "I'm sorry, but I don't know anyone by that name," Trevor replied evenly. Harrison's eyes narrowed. "Mr. He paused, waiting for Trevor to fill in the blank. "Stone. And you are?" Harrison Blake, representing the Vanderbilt family interests. "Mr. Stone, I'm sure you're a decent man, but you don't understand the situation you've become involved in. Miss Vanderbilt is not well. She's been under tremendous stress, and she's not thinking clearly. The kindest thing you can do is let me take her home where she can receive proper care. The kindest thing I can do is let her make her own choices." Trevor said, "Choices?" Harrison's laugh was similar to Sebastian's, cold and dismissive. "Mr. Stone, do you know who Serafina Vanderbilt is? Do you understand the responsibilities she carries, the obligations she was born into? I understand that she's a person, not a business asset." Harrison studied Trevor more carefully, taking in his work clothes, the modest neighborhood, the obvious gap between their worlds. "I see. And what exactly do you think your role is in this situation?" "I helped someone who needed help. Nothing more complicated than that." How refreshingly simple. Harrison's tone was patronizing now. "But life isn't simple for people like the Vanderbilts. Every decision has consequences that ripple through hundreds of lives. Serafina's wedding today will secure the future of a company that employs half this town. Her impulse could destroy that." From inside the house, Trevor could hear Aiden's voice, high with anxiety, asking Serafina questions about the man at the door. The sound strengthened his resolve. "Then maybe the problem isn't with her impulse," Trevor said. "Maybe the problem is with a system that puts that kind of pressure on one person." "Spoken like someone who's never had to make decisions that matter," Harrison replied sharply. "Mr. Stone, I'm going to be very clear with you. The Vanderbilt family has resources you can't imagine. Legal resources, financial resources, social resources. If you continue to interfere with family business, those resources can be turned in directions that would be very uncomfortable for you and your son." The threat hung in the air between them, subtle but unmistakable. Trevor felt a familiar surge of protective anger, the same feeling that had driven him to stand up to bullies in Aiden's school, to bureaucrats who tried to deny his son's services, to anyone who thought they could use power to hurt the people he loved. "Are you threatening my family?" Trevor asked, his voice quiet but dangerous. "I'm explaining reality," Harrison replied smoothly. "Serafina belongs with her family. You belong with yours. Everyone will be happier if those boundaries are respected." "Mr. Blake?" Serafina's voice came from behind Trevor, calm and clear. She'd approached the door quietly, and now stood beside him with her chin raised and her shoulders straight. Gone was the frightened woman from the crashed car. In her place stood someone who looked every inch the heiress she'd been born to be. "Miss Vanderbilt," Harrison said, relief evident in his voice. "Thank goodness, your mother is beside herself with worry. If we leave now, we can still salvage the situation. The guests can be told you had a minor accident, but you're fine now." "Tell my mother that I'm safe and well," Serafina said. "Tell her that I'll contact her when I'm ready to discuss my future. But I won't be returning today, and I won't be attending any wedding." Harrison's composure cracked slightly. "Serafina, you're not thinking clearly. Yesterday was traumatic, but you can't let one difficult night destroy everything your father built." "My father is dead," Serafina said, echoing her earlier words to Sebastian, "and I'm finally ready to start living." She stepped back and closed the door, leaving Harrison standing on the porch in obvious shock. Through the window, they watched him return to his car, his phone already pressed to his ear as he made what was undoubtedly an urgent call to Rosalind Vanderbilt. "That was brave," Trevor said. That was terrifying, Serafina corrected. But she was smiling. I've never said no to my mother before, not directly. Aiden appeared beside them, still clutching his rocket. Is the angry man gone? He's gone, buddy, Trevor confirmed. Good. I didn't like the way he looked at Dad. Aiden turned to Serafina with the serious expression he wore when discussing important matters. Are you going to stay with us now? The question hung in the air, loaded with implications none of them were quite ready to face. Serafina knelt down to Aiden's level, her heart breaking a little at the hope in his eyes. I don't know yet, she said honestly, but I know that meeting you and your dad was the best thing that's happened to me in a very long time. Outside, more cars were beginning to appear on the quiet street. Word was spreading, and Serafina's sanctuary was about to become the center of a storm that would test everything they'd discovered about each other in these few precious hours of peace. By noon, Maple Street looked like a crime scene. 3 black sedans lined the curb outside Trevor's duplex, their tinted windows reflecting the curiosity of neighbors who had emerged from their homes to witness the unprecedented sight of wealth descending upon their working-class neighborhood. Mrs. Medina had positioned herself strategically on her front porch with a cup of coffee and the kind of vigilant expression that suggested she was prepared to defend her territory against any threat, foreign or domestic. Trevor stood at his living room window watching a 4th car pull up. This one was different from the others, a silver Bentley that whispered money in a way the sedans merely shouted it. The woman who emerged from the back seat moved with the fluid grace of someone who had never doubted her right to command any space she entered. Rosalind Vanderbilt was 63 years old, silver-haired, and possessed the kind of bone-deep elegance that suggested generations of careful breeding and unlimited resources. That's Mother, Serafina said quietly, appearing beside Trevor at the window. Her voice carried a complex mixture of emotions, love, fear, resentment, and something that might have been relief that the confrontation she'd been avoiding was finally here. Aiden sat on the couch behind them, his rocket models abandoned in favor of drawing what appeared to be a space battle in his sketchbook. He'd been unusually quiet since the arrival of the first car, his sensitive nature picking up on the tension that filled the house like a gathering storm. Do you want me to send her away? Trevor asked, though they both knew that Rosalind Vanderbilt was not a woman who could be simply sent away. No, Serafina said, straightening her shoulders in a gesture that reminded Trevor of a soldier preparing for battle. I need to face her eventually. It might as well be now. The knock on the door came precisely 60 seconds later. Not the urgent pounding of Harrison Blake or the frustrated hammering that Sebastian might have employed, but a measured, authoritative rap that somehow conveyed both politeness and absolute expectation of compliance. Trevor opened the door to find Rosalind Vanderbilt standing on his small porch as if she belonged there, her gaze taking in every detail of the modest duplex with the calculating efficiency of a general surveying a battlefield. She was smaller than he'd expected, probably no more than 5 feet 4 inches in her designer heels, but she radiated the kind of presence that made height irrelevant. Mr. Stone, she said, her voice carrying the refined accent of private schools and European finishing schools. I'm Rosalind Vanderbilt. I believe you have something that belongs to me. Someone, Trevor corrected gently, and she belongs to herself. A smile flickered across Rosalind's lips, so brief it might have been imagined. How refreshingly idealistic. May I come in? I think we have several things to discuss. Trevor stepped aside, and Rosalind entered his living room with the same composed confidence she might have brought to a corporate boardroom. Her gaze swept over the mismatched furniture, the family photos, the evidence of a life lived on a budget, but with care. And if she felt any judgment, it didn't show on her carefully controlled features. Mother, Serafina said, rising from the couch. Serafina. Rosalind's voice carried disappointment, relief, and something that might have been love, all carefully modulated to reveal nothing vulnerable. You look terrible, darling. Have you been sleeping in those clothes? I've been thinking, Serafina replied, about father, about the business, about what I actually want my life to look like. I see. And your conclusions? That I can't marry Sebastian, that I won't marry Sebastian, and that I'm prepared to face whatever consequences that decision brings. Rosalind was quiet for a moment, her gaze shifting to take in Trevor, who stood near the doorway with his arms crossed, and Aidan, who was watching the adults with the intense focus he brought to anything that might affect his carefully ordered world. Mr. Stone, Rosalind said, turning her attention to Trevor, might I speak with my daughter privately? If that's what she wants, Trevor replied, looking to Serafina for confirmation. It's fine, Serafina said. Aidan, would you like to show me your room? I'd love to see more of your space collection. Aidan brightened immediately, clearly pleased to have a reason to escape the tense adult conversation. He gathered his rocket models carefully and led Serafina down the hallway, chattering about the differences between liquid and solid fuel. Propulsion systems. When they were alone, Rosalind settled herself on Trevor's couch with the same regal bearing she might have brought to a throne. Sit, please, Mr. Stone. I'm not fond of looking up at people when I'm trying to understand them. Trevor took the armchair across from her, acutely aware of the contrast they must have presented. The billionaire matriarch in her perfectly tailored suit and the working man in his jeans and work shirt, separated by more than just the width of a coffee table. You rescued my daughter last night? Rosalind said, without preamble. I helped someone who needed help. And now you're continuing to help her avoid her responsibilities. I'm giving her space to make her own choices. Rosalind studied him with the sharp intelligence that had helped her maintain control of a business empire after her husband's death. Tell me about yourself, Mr. Stone. What is it you do for a living? I work loading dock at Morrison Freight, part-time at Patterson's Auto Repair, and I do landscaping on weekends when I can get it. 3 jobs. That must be exhausting. It pays the bills, mostly. And your son, Aidan, is it? He seems like a remarkable child. Trevor's protective instincts flared. He is, and he's not part of whatever negotiation you think we're having. Of course not, Rosalind said smoothly. I'm simply trying to understand the situation my daughter has placed herself in. You're a single father, working multiple jobs to support your family. That requires a certain kind of strength, a certain dedication to responsibility. I respect that. But I wonder if you fully understand what you're encouraging Serafina to give up. Not just wealth, though that's considerable, but purpose, legacy, the opportunity to make a meaningful difference in hundreds of lives. Trevor leaned forward slightly. With respect, Mrs. Vanderbilt, it seems to me that you're confusing meaningful with profitable. Rosalind's eyebrows rose a fraction. Explain. Your daughter spent 20 minutes this morning listening to my 8-year-old explain rocket propulsion, and she was genuinely interested. She helped him arrange his models and ask questions that made him think. That's meaningful. Marrying someone she doesn't love to preserve a business arrangement isn't. And what happens to the 1,200 people who work for Vanderbilt Industries when the company fails? What happens to their families, their children's college funds, their retirement plans? Is my daughter's personal happiness worth more than their livelihoods? The question hit Trevor hard, because it was fair, because it highlighted the impossible weight that had been placed on Serafina's shoulders. But he thought about Hannah, about the way she'd refused to let her illness become an excuse for half measures or compromises that betrayed her values. Maybe, he said slowly, the real question is why the welfare of 1,200 families depends on one woman sacrificing her life for a business decision. Maybe the system that creates that kind of pressure is the problem, not the person who refuses to participate in it. From down the hallway came the sound of Aiden's excited voice explaining the lunar landing sequence to Serafina, punctuated by her questions and genuine praise. The joy in both their voices was unmistakable, a stark contrast to the tension in the living room. "She seems fond of your son," Rosalind observed. "Aiden's easy to love. He sees the world differently than most people, but he sees it clearly. No hidden agendas, no manipulation, just honest connection. Is that what you think my daughter needs, honest connection?" Trevor met her gaze directly. "I think everyone needs that, but especially people who've been taught that their value comes from what they can provide for others instead of who they are." Rosalind was quiet for a long moment, and for the first time since she'd entered his home, Trevor caught a glimpse of something vulnerable beneath her composed exterior. When she spoke again, her voice was softer, more personal. Serafina's father died at his desk, working on a merger that would have secured the company's future for another generation. His last words to me were concerns about market projections and competitive positioning. Not about our daughter, not about whether she was happy, but about the business. "I'm sorry for your loss." "Are you? Or are you glad that he's not here to complicate your simple narrative about love conquering all?" Trevor considered this carefully. "I'm sorry that he never got to see what I saw this morning. His daughter being genuinely happy, connecting with people who care about her for who she is, not what she represents. I'm sorry that he spent his life building something that required his daughter's sacrifice to survive. And if I told you that letting her walk away from this marriage would destroy everything he built, that it would cost jobs, devastate communities, unravel decades of careful planning, then I'd say that's a hell of a burden to put on one person's heart." Before Rosalind could respond, the sound of car doors slamming outside drew their attention. Through the window, Trevor could see Sebastian Drake emerging from a red Porsche, his face flushed with anger and his expensive suit wrinkled from what had clearly been a frantic morning. Behind him came two men in suits who looked like security or possibly lawyers, their expressions grim and purposeful. "Sebastian," Rosalind murmured, a note of disapproval in her voice. "I told him to wait." The pounding on the door that followed was nothing like Rosalind's measured knock. It was aggressive, demanding, the sound of someone who had reached the end of his patience. "Open the door, Serafina!" Sebastian's voice carried clearly through the thin walls. "This has gone on long. Enough. We have 300 guests waiting at the church, and I'm not going to be humiliated because you're having some kind of breakdown." Aiden's excited chatter stopped abruptly from down the hallway, replaced by a silence that Trevor recognized as his son processing something too loud, too chaotic, too threatening for his sensitive system. In moments, that silence would likely transform into the kind of meltdown that could take hours to resolve. Trevor stood, his protective instincts overriding every other consideration. "Mrs. Vanderbilt, I need you to get your future son-in-law under control, or I'm calling the police." "Sebastian," Rosalind called out sharply, her voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to immediate obedience. "That's quite enough." But Sebastian was beyond hearing reason, beyond caring about consequences. The door shook under his continued assault, and Trevor could hear neighbors beginning to emerge from their homes, drawn by the commotion. From the hallway came a small, distressed sound that made Trevor's heart clench, Aiden's voice high and frightened. "Dad, the angry man is back and he's really loud." Everything else, the business consequences, the family drama, the impossible weight of other people's expectations, faded into background noise. Trevor's son needed him, and that was the only equation that mattered. The sound that came from Aiden's room was one that Trevor knew too well, a low, keening cry that meant his son's carefully constructed world was collapsing under the weight of too much chaos, too much noise, too much unpredictability. It was the sound that preceded complete meltdown, and Trevor had learned through painful experience that once Aidan reached that point, it could take hours to bring him back to calm. Sebastian's pounding intensified, and his voice grew more demanding. "I know you're in there, Serafina. Stop hiding behind these people and face your responsibilities like an adult." "Dad!" Aidan's voice cracked with panic from down the hallway. "Make it stop, please make it stop." Trevor's vision narrowed to a single point of focus. Everything else, Rosalind's presence, the family drama, the business implications, became secondary to the sound of his child in distress. He moved toward the front door with purpose, his expression shifting from polite concern to something far more dangerous. "Mrs. Vanderbilt," he said quietly, not taking his eyes off the door. "You need to get him away from my house now." But before Rosalind could respond, Trevor yanked open the front door, revealing Sebastian Drake in all his entitled fury. The man was younger than Trevor had expected, probably early 30s, with the kind of soft good looks that came from a lifetime of privilege and the kind of barely controlled rage that came from never being told no. "Where is she?" Sebastian demanded, trying to push past Trevor into the house. Trevor's hand shot out, catching Sebastian's chest and stopping him cold. "You're not coming into my home. I have every right." "You have no rights here," Trevor said, his voice deadly calm. "This is my property, and you're disturbing my family. You need to leave." Behind Sebastian, the two men in suits stepped forward, clearly prepared to escalate the situation. But before anyone could move, Mrs. Medina's voice cut through the tension like a blade. "Trevor Stone, what's all this commotion about?" She stood at the edge of Trevor's yard, her coffee cup still in hand, but her expression had shifted from curious concern to protective grandmother mode. Behind her, other neighbors had begun to emerge. Bob Martinez from across the street, still wearing his electrician's uniform from the night shift. Sarah Collins from next door, holding her toddler on her hip. Old Mr. Patterson from the corner house, his age-spotted hands gripping a walking stick that looked suspiciously like it could double as a weapon. "Mom," Sebastian said, turning toward Mrs. Medina with the patronizing smile he probably used on his secretary. "This is a private family matter. I'm sure you understand." Mrs. Medina's eyebrows rose to dangerous heights. "Family matter? Young man, I've been living on this street for 43 years, and Trevor Stone is more family to me than some blood relatives. So if you're disturbing him and that sweet boy of his, it's my business too." From inside the house came another distressed cry from Aidan, followed by the sound of Serafina's voice, gentle and soothing. "It's okay, Aidan. I'm here. Your dad is here. We're going to make it quiet again." The sound of his son's pain stripped away the last of Trevor's restraint. He stepped forward, closing the distance between himself and Sebastian until they were almost nose to nose. "You see those people?" Trevor said, gesturing toward the neighbors who had gathered. "They've got my back. You see that little boy in there who's scared because of your tantrum? He's got my full protection. And you see this woman you claim to love? She's already told you no. So you have exactly 10 seconds to get in your car and drive away before I call the police and have you arrested for trespassing and disturbing the peace." Sebastian's face flushed darker. "You have no idea who you're dealing with. I can destroy you. One phone call and you'll lose every job you have. Your son will lose his school placement. You'll be evicted from this pathetic little..." He never finished the sentence. Trevor's hand closed around the front of Sebastian's designer shirt, and suddenly, the younger man found himself backed against his own car, with 200 pounds of determined father pinning him in place. "Let me explain something to you," Trevor said, his voice so quiet that Sebastian had to strain to hear it. "I've been broke before. I've been homeless before. I've worked 16-hour days and still had to choose between groceries and utilities. But you know what I've never been? I've never been the kind of man who threatens a child to get what I want." "Trevor," Rosalind's voice came from behind him, carrying a note of warning. "Mrs. Vanderbilt," Trevor said without turning around. "Your future son-in-law just threatened my 8-year-old boy. In my neighborhood, that's the kind of mistake people only get to make once." The two men in suits moved forward, but found their path blocked by Bob Martinez and Mr. Patterson, both of whom had positioned themselves strategically between the confrontation and the luxury cars. It was a standoff that spoke to deep cultural divides, old money meeting working class solidarity, entitled Privilege Confronting Protective Community. From inside the house, Serafina's voice could be heard clearly through the open door. "Aiden, can you show me your breathing exercises? The ones your dad taught you. In for 4 counts, hold for 4, out for 4. The sound of his son's labored breathing trying to match Serafina's calm cadence was like a knife to Trevor's heart. He released Sebastian with a disgusted shove and stepped back. "Get off my street," he said. "And if you come back, I won't be nearly this polite." Sebastian straightened his shirt, his face a mask of humiliation and rage. "This isn't over. You have no idea what you've just started." "Actually," said a new voice from the sidewalk, "I think it might be." Detective Marco Silva stood beside his unmarked police car, his badge visible on his belt, and his expression suggesting he'd been watching the confrontation with professional interest. He was a big man, probably in his late 40s, with the kind of calm authority that came from years of dealing with volatile situations. "Morning, Trevor," Marco said with a slight nod. "Mrs. Medina called about a disturbance. Everything okay here?" Trevor had known Marco for years. Their sons had played Little League together before Aiden's diagnosis made team sports too overwhelming. The detective's presence was like a shield dropping between Trevor's family and the forces arrayed against them. "Just some visitors who were having trouble understanding the word no," Trevor replied. Marco's gaze swept over the luxury cars, the men in suits, Sebastian's disheveled appearance, and the gathered neighbors. "I see. Well, sometimes people need help with vocabulary. Gentlemen," he addressed Sebastian and his companions, "I'm going to suggest you move along. This is a residential neighborhood, and the residents have a right to peace and quiet." "Officer," Sebastian began, his voice taking on the entitled tone of someone accustomed to special treatment, "this is a family matter involving the Vanderbilt family. I'm sure you understand the delicate nature." "Detective," Marco corrected firmly. "And what I understand is that you're on public property, disturbing the peace and threatening local residents. Unless you have legal business here, I suggest you find somewhere else to conduct your family discussions." Sebastian looked to the men in suits, who both subtly shook their heads. Whatever authority they might wield in boardrooms and courthouses, it didn't extend to small-town police officers who were more interested in protecting families than preserving business deals. "This isn't finished," Sebastian said, directing his words toward the house where Serafina remained with Aiden. "Yes," said Rosalind Vanderbilt quietly. "It is." Everyone turned toward her in surprise. She stood in Trevor's doorway, her composure intact, but something fundamental shifted in her bearing. Behind her, Serafina appeared with Aiden's hand clasped firmly in hers. The boy's eyes were red-rimmed from crying, but he'd stopped shaking, and he looked up at Serafina with the kind of trust he usually reserved for his father. "Sebastian," Rosalind continued, her voice carrying the kind of authority that had commanded boardrooms for decades, "you're embarrassing yourself and disgracing both our families. Go home." "Rosalind, we had an agreement." "We had an arrangement," she corrected sharply. "An arrangement that depended on mutual consent, which has clearly been withdrawn. The merger can proceed without a marriage, or it can fail. Either way, it won't be built on my daughter's misery." Sebastian stared at her in shock. "You can't be serious." The financial implications alone will be dealt with by people who are paid to deal with financial implications. My job is to be Serafina's mother, not her pimp." The word hung in the air like a slap, and Sebastian's face went white with rage and humiliation. For a moment, Trevor thought the man might do something truly stupid, but the combined presence of Detective Silva, the gathered neighbors, and Mrs. Medina's withering glare seemed to penetrate even his entitled fury. "You'll regret this," Sebastian said, but the words lacked conviction. He was already backing toward his car, followed by his companions. "I regret many things," Rosalind replied calmly, "but standing up for my daughter won't be one of them." As the cars pulled away from Maple Street, the neighborhood slowly returned to normal. Neighbors drifted back to their homes with waves and murmured reassurances. Detective Silva lingered long enough to get Trevor's version of events and to ruffle Aiden's hair with the easy familiarity of an old family friend. "You call me if they come back," Marco said as he prepared to leave. "And Trevor, good for you, standing up for your family." When the street was finally quiet again, the four of them stood in Trevor's living room, processing what had just happened. Aiden remained close to Serafina, his small hand still clasped in hers, while Trevor and Rosalind regarded each other with new understanding. "Thank you," Serafina said softly to her mother. "I know that wasn't easy." "No," Rosalind agreed, "but watching you with that child, seeing how you handled his distress, how you put his needs above everything else, that's when I remembered who I raised you to be. Not a business asset, but a person capable of real love." She turned to Trevor, extending her hand with the same dignity she might have brought to a peace treaty. "Mr. Stone, I owe you an apology. And more than that, I owe you thanks for showing my daughter what genuine caring looks like." Trevor shook her hand, surprised by the strength of her grip. "She figured that out on her own, Mrs. Vanderbilt. I just gave her somewhere safe to do it." Aiden tugged on Serafina's sleeve. His crisis passed, but his need for routine and predictability still evident. "Are you going to stay for lunch? Dad makes really good grilled cheese, and I want to show you my book about Mars." Serafina looked at her mother, then at Trevor, then down at the little boy whose trust she'd somehow earned in the space of a few hours. "I'd like that very much," she said, "if that's okay with everyone." And for the first time since she'd fled her own wedding, Serafina Vanderbilt felt like she was exactly where she belonged. 3 days after what Aiden had dubbed the Day of the Angry Cars, life on Maple Street had settled into a rhythm that felt both natural and surreal. Serafina Vanderbilt, heiress to a manufacturing fortune, sat cross-legged on Trevor's living room floor, helping an 8-year-old boy sort his collection of space-themed trading cards by mission date, while debating the relative merits of chemical versus ion propulsion systems. "The ion drives are more efficient for long-distance travel," Aiden explained, holding up a card featuring an artist's rendering of a deep space probe. "But chemical rockets have better thrust for escaping Earth's gravity well." "That makes sense," Serafina replied, studying the technical specifications on the back of the card with genuine interest. "It's like choosing the right tool for the job. Sometimes you need power, sometimes you need efficiency." Trevor watched this exchange from the kitchen doorway, a dish towel in his hands, and something warm spreading through his chest that had nothing to do with the coffee he'd been drinking. For 3 days, Serafina had thrown herself into the routine of their modest household with an enthusiasm that initially surprised him and gradually began to feel essential. She helped Aiden with his morning routine, learned to make pancakes the way he liked them, perfectly round with exactly 3 blueberries arranged in a triangle, and spent hours listening to his elaborate theories about space colonization with the kind of attention that made the boy glow with pride. More than that, she seemed to be discovering parts of herself that had been buried under years of family expectations and social obligations. The woman who had once attended charity galas, where she smiled politely while wealthy donors discussed her like a business asset, now sat on the floor in jeans and one of Trevor's old sweaters, genuinely excited about helping a child organize his treasures. "Dad," Aidan called out, "Serafina thinks I should write a letter to NASA about my ideas for Mars-based construction. Do you think they'd really read it?" "I think NASA loves hearing from smart kids with big ideas," Trevor replied, moving into the living room to join them. "And your ideas are pretty impressive." Serafina looked up at him, her hair falling loose around her shoulders in a way that made her look younger, more relaxed than the composed heiress he'd first encountered. "He's been telling me about his design for a modular habitat system. It's actually quite brilliant. Each module could be launched separately and assembled in orbit before the journey to Mars." "Serafina used to study engineering before she had to switch to business," Aidan said, as if this explained everything important about the universe. Trevor raised an eyebrow. "Engineering?" "Mechanical, with a focus on sustainable systems," Serafina said, a hint of old wistfulness in her voice. "I wanted to design clean energy solutions, maybe work on renewable infrastructure. But Father convinced me that if I was going to inherit the company, I needed to understand finance and management instead." "What stopped you from going back to it after college?" Serafina was quiet for a moment, her fingers absently straightening an already perfectly organized pile of trading cards. "I guess I convinced myself that wanting something different was selfish, that I had obligations to fulfill first, and maybe someday I could pursue my own interests." "Someday," Trevor repeated softly. "That's a dangerous word. It usually means never." Their eyes met across Aidan's trading card display, and something passed between them that had been building for 3 days, but neither had acknowledged directly. The attraction had been there from the beginning, underlying their conversations about family and responsibility, and the courage to choose your own life. But it had been complicated by crisis, by the dramatic circumstances that had brought them together, by the vast differences in their backgrounds and resources. Now, in the quiet normalcy of an afternoon spent organizing space cards and debating rocket fuel, it felt less complicated and more inevitable. Aidan, oblivious to the adult undercurrents swirling around him, continued his explanation of Mars colonization logistics. The hardest part would be getting enough water for a permanent settlement. You could extract it from the polar ice caps, but that would require a lot of infrastructure. "What about atmospheric processing?" Serafina asked, forcing her attention back to the conversation. "If you could increase the atmospheric pressure and introduce more oxygen, terraforming." Aidan's eyes lit up, "but that would take hundreds of years, maybe thousands." "Some things are worth waiting for," Serafina said, though her gaze flickered toward Trevor as she spoke. The sound of a car pulling into the driveway interrupted their discussion. Through the window, Trevor could see a familiar silver Honda that belonged to Chris Bartlett, his best friend and fellow mechanic from Patterson's garage. Chris had been calling and texting for 3 days, increasingly concerned about Trevor's unexplained absence from work and the rumors circulating around town about the confrontation with the Vanderbilt family. "That's Chris," Trevor said, recognizing both the car and the determined set of his friend's shoulders as he approached the front door. "He's probably here to make sure I haven't been kidnapped by rich people." Chris Bartlett was built like a tree trunk, short, solid, and virtually immovable when he'd made up his mind about something. He'd been Trevor's friend since high school, had served as Aidan's unofficial uncle since Hannah's death, and possessed the kind of loyalty that made him protective to the point of stubbornness. "Trevor Stone," Chris said as soon as the door opened. "You better have a damn good explanation for why you've been dodging my calls and why half of Thornfield is talking about you getting mixed up with billionaires and runaway brides." "Come in," Trevor said, stepping aside. And Chris meets Serafina. Serafina, this is Chris, my oldest friend and the person most likely to give me grief about any decision I make. Chris stopped short when he saw Serafina sitting on the living room floor with Aidan, taking in her jeans and sweater, her relaxed posture, the way she smiled at his friend with obvious affection. Whatever he'd been expecting, it clearly wasn't. This domestic scene. "Ma'am?" Chris said, his natural politeness warring with his curiosity. "I hope you'll forgive me, but I've been worried about Trevor and Aidan. Things have been pretty crazy around town." "I understand completely," Serafina replied, rising gracefully from the floor. "And I'm grateful that Trevor has friends who care enough to check on him. That says a lot about the kind of man he is." Chris glanced between them, his expression shifting from suspicion to speculation. "Right. Well, Trevor, we need to talk." They moved to the kitchen, leaving Serafina with Aidan, who immediately resumed his explanation of Mars-based construction as if the interruption had never happened. Chris helped himself to coffee and studied Trevor with the practiced eye of someone who'd known him for 20 years. "So," Chris said finally, "you want to tell me what's really going on here?" Trevor ran a hand through his hair, unsure where to start. "It's complicated. Everything's complicated. Start with the simple version. I got a wrong number call 3 nights ago. Woman in distress. I went to help, and it turned out to be Serafina Vanderbilt running away from an arranged marriage." "Okay. And now she's living in your house because she needed somewhere safe to figure out what she wanted her life to look like. And because," Trevor trailed off, searching for words that would make sense even to himself, "because you're falling for her," Chris finished. "It's not that simple." "It's exactly that simple. The question is whether you're thinking with your head or your heart, and whether you've considered what this means for Aidan." The concern in Chris's voice was genuine, born from years of watching Trevor struggle to balance his own needs with his responsibilities as a single father. Chris had seen Trevor turn down dates, job opportunities, even friendships when they threatened to disrupt Aidan's carefully maintained stability. "Aidan loves her," Trevor said quietly. "I've never seen him connect with someone so quickly, so completely. She's patient with his routines, interested in his obsessions, gentle when he gets overwhelmed. It's like she understands him instinctively, and that's great. But what happens when she decides to go back to her old life? What happens to Aidan when the novelty wears off and she remembers that she's worth more money than our entire neighborhood?" "Combined," Trevor started to protest, but Chris held up a hand. "I'm not saying she's not a good person. From what I can see, she seems genuine. But Trevor, you live in different worlds. She's slumming it here for a few days, figuring herself out, having an adventure. But eventually, reality's going to set in. You think she'll leave?" "I think people usually end up where they started, especially when they've got the kind of resources that make any problem solvable with enough money." From the living room came the sound of Aidan's laughter, followed by Serafina's voice explaining something about orbital mechanics with the kind of enthusiasm that suggested she was enjoying the conversation as much as he was. The sound made Trevor's chest tighten with something that felt like hope and fear in equal measure. "Maybe," Trevor said finally, "but maybe not. Maybe this is her chance to become who she was always meant to be, instead of who she was expected to be." Chris sipped his coffee and studied his friend's face. "You really care about her?" "Yeah, I do." "And she cares about you?" Trevor thought. About the way Serafina looked at him when she thought he wasn't watching, the careful way she touched his arm when they passed in the narrow hallway, the conversations that stretched late into the night after Aidan was asleep. "I think so. I hope so. Then you better figure out what you're going to do about it, because this limbo situation can't last forever. She's going to have to make some real decisions about her life, and you're going to have to decide whether you're willing to be part of whatever she chooses. Before Trevor could respond, Aiden's voice called out from the living room. "Dad, Serafina says she might know someone who could help me send my Mars-based designs to NASA for real. Can we do that?" Trevor and Chris exchanged glances, the optimism in Aiden's voice highlighting exactly what was at stake. Chris clapped Trevor on the shoulder with rough affection. "Just be careful," Chris said quietly. "I don't want to see either of you get hurt." As Chris prepared to leave, Serafina appeared in the kitchen doorway, Aiden's hand clasped in hers. "Mr. Bartlett, I hope you don't mind my asking, but Trevor mentioned you work at Patterson's garage. Do you happen to know anything about restoring vintage cars?" Chris's eyebrows rose. "Some. Why?" "I've been thinking about what I want to do next, now that I'm not getting married or managing family business interests. I have a trust fund that's separate from the family company, enough to start something of my own. I was wondering about the feasibility of opening a restoration shop, maybe specializing in classic American muscle cars." "You know cars?" Chris asked, his skepticism evident. "I know engineering principles and mechanical systems. The rest I could learn with the right teacher." Trevor felt something shift in his chest as he listened to her talk about plans that seemed to involve staying, building something new in Thornfield, creating a life that was hers instead of someone else's design for her future. "There's definitely a market for it," Chris said slowly. "Rich folks around here love their vintage Mustangs and Camaros. Question is whether you're serious about getting your hands dirty." Serafina smiled, and Trevor caught a glimpse of the determined woman who had refused to marry Sebastian Drake, who had walked away from a fortune to sleep on a stranger's couch. "Mr. Bartlett, I've spent my whole life being clean and proper and suitable. I think it's time I tried getting dirty." That evening, after Chris had left and Aiden was in bed, Trevor and Serafina sat on his back porch steps, sharing a bottle of wine that she'd somehow acquired during one of her mysterious errands around town. The night was cool, but not cold, filled with the sounds of suburban evening, televisions murmuring through windows, dogs barking at distant sirens, the occasional car passing on the main road. "Are you serious about the restoration shop?" Trevor asked. "Dead serious. I've been thinking about it for 3 days, running numbers, researching the market. I could start small, maybe rent space in an existing garage, build up a client base. It's hard work, physical, dirty, often frustrating." "Good," Serafina said firmly. "I want work that means something, that creates something beautiful and lasting. I want to wake up excited about my day instead of dreading another round of board meetings and charity luncheons." Trevor studied her profile in the dim light from the kitchen window. "And your family? The business?" "Mother and I talked this afternoon, while you were at the store. The company will survive without the merger. It'll mean some restructuring, maybe selling off some divisions, but it won't collapse. And honestly, it might be healthier in the long run. Father built something impressive, but he also built something that required constant expansion to survive. Maybe it's time for it to find a sustainable size. What about Sebastian?" Serafina's expression darkened slightly. "Sebastian will find another heiress to marry. There are plenty of women whose families are willing to trade daughters for business advantages, but it won't be me." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, the wine and the evening air making everything feel possible and profound. Finally, Serafina turned to face him directly. "Trevor, I need to ask you something, and I need you to be honest with me." "Okay. Is this real? What's happening between us? Or am I just a project to you, someone you rescued who needed help getting back on her feet?" The question hung in the air between them, loaded with vulnerability and hope. Trevor set down his wineglass and turned to face her fully. "Serafina," he said quietly, "3 days ago, I thought I had my life figured out. Work, Aiden, getting by day to day. I wasn't looking for anything else, wasn't expecting anything else. But watching you with my son, seeing how you light up when you talk about engineering or car restoration, the way you fit into our life like you were always supposed to be here. This isn't a rescue anymore. This is me falling in love with you." Her breath caught, and for a moment neither of them moved. Then she leaned forward and kissed him, soft and tentative at first, then with growing certainty. When they broke apart, she rested her forehead against his. "I love you too," she whispered. "And I love Aiden. And I love this life we're building together, even though it's not what you grew up with, especially because it's not what I grew up with. Trevor, I've never been happier than I've been these past 3 days. I've never felt more like myself." From inside the house came a small sound, Aiden calling out in his sleep, probably caught in one of his recurring dreams about rocket ships and distant planets. Without thinking, both Trevor and Serafina stood to check on him, moving with the synchronized concern of parents who'd been together for years instead of days. They found Aiden peaceful, his blankets arranged with the precise geometry he required. For sleep, his stuffed astronaut tucked securely under one arm. Trevor adjusted the covers, while Serafina straightened the solar system mobile that hung above his bed, both of them careful not to wake him. In the hallway outside his room, with the sound of their son's peaceful breathing behind them, Trevor took Serafina's hand. "So what happens now?" he asked. "Now we build something together," she said, "all 3 of us." And for the first time since Hannah's death, Trevor allowed himself to believe that happily ever after might be possible after all. 6 weeks later, Trevor stood in the doorway of what had once been Patterson's back garage bay, watching Serafina wrestle with the carburetor of a 1967 Mustang Fastback, while Aiden sat cross-legged nearby, reading aloud from a manual about fuel injection systems. Her face was streaked with grease, her hair pulled back in a messy ponytail, and her jeans bore the honest stains of real work. She had never looked more beautiful to him. "The jets are completely gummed up," Serafina said, holding up a small metal component to the light. "This car's been sitting in someone's garage for 15 years, and I don't think they ever properly stored the fuel system. That's why you have to use fuel stabilizer if you're not going to drive it regularly," Aiden said without looking up from his manual. "It prevents the gasoline from turning into varnish." "Exactly right," Serafina replied, beaming at him with the kind of pride that made Trevor's chest tighten with happiness. "You're going to make an excellent mechanical engineer someday." The transformation of the old garage into Vanderbilt Classic restorations had taken 5 weeks, countless permits, and more manual labor than Serafina had ever imagined. She'd rented the space from old Mr. Patterson, who'd been thrilled to have his unused bay producing income again. The deal had been simple: reasonable rent in exchange for her helping him restore his own collection of vintage farm equipment. Trevor had spent his evenings and weekends helping her set up the workspace, install proper ventilation, and organize the tools and equipment she'd purchased with the methodical enthusiasm of someone discovering a passion they'd never been allowed to pursue. Chris had been skeptical at first, but even he had come around. After watching her spend 3 hours researching the proper way to rebuild a Rochester Quadrajet carburetor. "She's got the patience for it," he'd admitted to Trevor the week before. "And the attention to detail. Half these rich folks who think they want to play mechanic give up the first time they break a nail." But she's in here at 7 in the morning, working through lunch, asking the right questions. The business was growing faster than any of them had expected. Word had spread through the network of classic car enthusiasts who gathered at weekend shows and monthly club meetings. Serafina's combination of engineering knowledge, genuine passion, and perfectionist attention to detail was earning her a reputation that transcended her family name. More importantly, she was happy in a way that seemed to radiate from her very bones. Gone was the polished, carefully controlled heiress who'd fled her wedding 6 weeks ago. In her place was a woman who got excited about compression ratios and paint formulations, who celebrated small victories like a perfectly rebuilt transmission with the enthusiasm of a child at Christmas. "Dad," Aidan said, finally looking up from his manual, "Mrs. Patterson called while you were at the store. She wanted to know if Serafina could look at their tractor. The hydraulics aren't working right." "More farm equipment," Trevor said with a smile. "You're becoming the go-to person for anything with an engine in this town." "I love it," Serafina replied, wiping her hands on a shop rag. "Every machine is like a puzzle that someone else solved decades ago. I just have to figure out how they did it, then make it work again." The sound of a car pulling into the gravel lot outside interrupted their conversation. Through the bay window, Trevor could see a familiar silver Bentley that made his stomach clench with old anxiety. It had been 6 weeks since Rosalind Vanderbilt's last visit, and while their relationship had improved dramatically, her presence still carried the weight of a world that felt foreign to his own. "That's Mother," Serafina said, following his gaze. "She's probably here for the monthly inspection." Rosalind had taken to visiting regularly, partly to check on her daughter's progress, partly to understand this new life she'd chosen. The visits had grown warmer and less formal over time, but they still carried an undercurrent of evaluation that made Trevor feel like he was being tested in ways he didn't fully understand. "Should I make coffee?" Trevor asked. "Please, and maybe hide some of the greasier tools." She's still adjusting to the idea of her daughter as a mechanic. Rosalind entered the garage with her usual elegant composure, though Trevor noticed she'd started wearing more practical shoes during these visits. Her gaze swept over the workspace with the critical eye of someone assessing an investment, taking in the organized tool cabinets, the lift that held a partially restored Camaro, the small office area where Serafina kept her business records. "Good afternoon, Serafina. Trevor." She nodded to each of them in turn, then smiled genuinely at Aidan, who had become her unexpected favorite during these visits. "Hello, Aidan. How are your space studies progressing?" "Really good, Mrs. Vanderbilt," Aidan replied, holding up his manual. "I'm learning about propulsion systems so I can help Serafina understand how car engines work. Did you know that rocket engines and car engines both use controlled explosions to create motion?" "I did not know that," Rosalind said, settling into the small chair that Serafina kept in the office area. "That sounds quite complicated." "Not really, it's just chemistry and physics working together. Serafina says that's what engineering is, making science do useful things." Rosalind's expression softened as she watched her daughter explain compression ratios to an 8-year-old with the kind of patience and enthusiasm she'd never shown for board meetings or social obligations. "She's quite right about that." Trevor brought coffee, and they settled into what had become their monthly ritual, a progress report disguised as a family visit. Serafina walked her mother through the business books, showing steady growth in both revenue and reputation. 3 cars were currently in for restoration, with a waiting list of potential clients that stretched into the following year. "The profit margins are better than I expected," Serafina said, pointing to a carefully organized spreadsheet. "Turns out that patience and attention to detail command premium prices in this market." "And you're enjoying the work?" Rosalind asked. though the answer was obvious in her daughter's animated expression. "More than I ever enjoyed anything in my old life. Mother, I wake up excited to come to work. I go to sleep thinking about problems I want to solve the next day. I never had that before." "Even when the work is physically demanding?" Serafina held up her hands, showing calluses earned from weeks of manual labor. "Especially then. These are honest calluses, earned by building something real. I've never been prouder of anything." Rosalind nodded slowly, and Trevor caught a glimpse of something that might have been relief in her expression. "Your father would have been proud too, you know. He always said that the best engineers were the ones who weren't afraid to get there. Hence dirty. You never told me that. There were many things I never told you, because I was so focused on preparing you for the life I thought you were supposed to have, instead of the life you were capable of creating." The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of another car, a police cruiser that pulled up beside Rosalind's Bentley. Detective Marco Silva emerged, but his expression was relaxed rather than official, and he waved casually as he approached. The open bay door. "Trevor, Serafina," Marco called out. "Hope you don't mind me stopping by. I wanted to ask Serafina about my dad's old Chevelle, the one I mentioned last week." Marco's father had left him a 1970 Chevelle SS that had been sitting in a barn for 20 years. The car had sentimental value, but needed extensive restoration work, and Marco had been saving for months to afford the kind of professional attention it required. "Of course," Serafina said, wiping her hands and moving toward the cruiser. "Did you bring the photos?" As Marco and Serafina discussed the scope of the restoration project, Trevor found himself alone with Rosalind for the first time in weeks. She studied him with the analytical gaze he'd learned to recognize, but her expression was warmer than it had been during their first meeting. "You look happy," she said finally. "I am. We all are. She's changed, you know. Not just her circumstances, but something fundamental about who she is. She's more confident, more decisive, more herself, if that makes sense." "It makes perfect sense," Trevor replied. "Sometimes people need permission to be who they really are, and sometimes they need someone to show them what genuine love looks like," Rosalind said quietly. "Thank you for that, Trevor. Thank you for seeing her as a person instead of an opportunity." Before Trevor could respond, Aidan appeared at his elbow, tugging on his sleeve with the kind of urgency that usually meant something important was happening in his 8-year-old world. "Dad, Detective Silva says his dad's car has the same engine as the car Serafina's working on now. Can we show him how she fixed the carburetor problem?" "If Detective Silva has time," Trevor said, ruffling his son's hair. "Actually, I'd love to see that," Marco said, overhearing. "I've been trying to learn more about engines so I can help with the restoration instead of just paying for it." What followed was an impromptu lesson in carburetor mechanics, with Serafina explaining the function of each component, while Aidan provided enthusiastic commentary about fuel-air mixtures and combustion efficiency. Marco took notes with the same intensity he probably brought to criminal investigations, while Rosalind watched her daughter teach with obvious pride. "You're a natural teacher," Marco said when the lesson concluded. "Ever think about offering classes? I bet there are a lot of people in town who'd love to learn basic automotive maintenance." "That's not a bad idea," Serafina mused. "I could use the garage space in the evenings, maybe offer workshops on weekends." "I'd sign up," Marco said. "And I know at least a dozen other cops who would too. Nothing worse than being stranded with a car problem you can't fix yourself." As the afternoon progressed and the conversation moved from business to family to plans for the future, Trevor found himself marveling at how naturally their different worlds had begun to blend. Rosalind asking Aidan serious questions about his space studies, Marco and Serafina discussing the therapeutic value of working with your hands, Chris arriving with parts for the Mustang and staying to debate the merits of different oil formulations. This was what family looked like, Trevor realized. Not the formal, obligation-bound relationships that Serafina had grown up with, but the chosen connections forged through shared interests, mutual respect, and genuine affection. "Trevor," Rosalind said as the sun began to set and the garage filled with golden light, "might I speak with you privately for a moment?" They stepped outside, leaving the others to continue their animated discussion about whether fuel injection was superior to carburation for classic car applications. Rosalind looked out over the modest neighborhood that surrounded the garage, taking in the chain-link fences, the small houses, the evidence of lives lived on budgets rather than trust funds. "I owe you an apology," she said finally. "You don't owe me anything. I do. When I first met you, I saw only what you lacked: money, social position, the kind of resources I thought were necessary for my daughter's happiness. I didn't see what you possessed, which was integrity, kindness, the ability to love someone for who they are rather than what they represent, the courage to build a life based on values rather than expectations." She turned to face him directly. "I spent 35 years trying to prepare Serafina for a life that would have slowly killed her spirit. You gave her permission to save herself." "She saved herself," Trevor said. "I just gave her somewhere safe to figure out how." "Perhaps. But you also showed her what a real partnership looks like, what it means to support someone's dreams instead of reshaping them to fit your own plans." From inside the garage came the sound of laughter, Aiden's delighted giggle, as Serafina demonstrated something involving spark plugs and timing. The sound made both Trevor and Rosalind smile. "She wants to ask you to marry her, you know," Rosalind said quietly. Trevor's heart stopped. "What?" "She's been researching engagement rings, asking surprisingly specific questions about my grandmother's jewelry collection. I suspect she's planning something romantic involving that boy of yours, and possibly some kind of rocket-themed proposal. How do you feel about that?" Rosalind smiled, and for the first time since he'd known her, it was completely genuine, reaching her eyes and transforming her face. "I feel like my daughter is finally going to marry someone who deserves her." That evening, after Marco had left with plans for his Chevelle and Rosalind had departed with promises to return the following month, Trevor sat on his back porch with Serafina and Aiden, watching the stars emerge in the clear autumn sky. Aiden pointed out constellations with the expertise of someone who'd memorized every astronomy book in the local library, while Serafina asked questions that showed she was genuinely learning. "Did you know," Aiden said, settling more comfortably, between them, "that some of the stars we're looking at don't exist anymore? The light takes so long to reach us that the star might have burned out, but we still see it shining." "That's beautiful and sad at the same time," Serafina said. "I think it's hopeful," Trevor replied, thinking about Hannah, about the way love could continue to shine long after its source was gone, lighting the way for new love to grow. Some things are so bright that they keep giving light even after they're finished. Serafina reached for his hand, intertwining their fingers with the comfortable familiarity of a couple who'd learned to fit together perfectly. "I love you," she said simply. "I love you too," Trevor replied, and meant it with every fiber of his being. Above them, the stars continued their ancient dance, marking time and bearing witness to the simple truth that sometimes the most important journeys begin with wrong numbers and end with found families. 2 months after Serafina Vanderbilt had fled her own wedding, she stood in Trevor's backyard at 6:30 in the morning, wearing coveralls and holding a cup of coffee, watching a 9-year-old boy make final adjustments to what appeared to be the most elaborate model rocket ever constructed in suburban Pennsylvania. Aiden had been working on the project for 3 weeks, with the kind of focused intensity he usually reserved for organizing his space cards or explaining orbital mechanics to anyone willing to listen. "The payload compartment has to be perfectly balanced," Aiden explained for the 5th time that morning, his small hands making minute adjustments to the rocket's nose cone. If the weight distribution is wrong, the whole flight path will be compromised. I understand, buddy, Serafina replied, though her stomach was fluttering with nerves that had nothing to do with rocket science. You've checked it 3 times. Everything's perfect. Trevor emerged from the kitchen carrying his own coffee and wearing the slightly bewildered expression of a man who'd woken up to find his backyard transformed into mission control for what his son insisted was the most important rocket launch in the history of space exploration. So, Trevor said, settling beside them on the picnic table that Aiden had designated as the observation deck. Remind me why we're launching rockets at dawn on a Saturday morning? Aiden turned to look at him with the patient expression he wore. When adults ask questions about things that should be obvious, because the weather conditions are optimal, and because Serafina has something important to ask you, and I'm helping. Trevor's eyebrows rose as he looked between his son and the woman who had quietly become the center of both their worlds. Is that so? Serafina felt her heart hammer against her ribs. She'd been planning this moment for weeks, ever since she'd realized that what she felt for Trevor and Aiden wasn't just gratitude or affection, but the kind of love that demanded permanent commitment. The kind of love that made her want to build something that would last longer than any business merger or family obligation. Aiden's been helping me with a special project, she said, trying to keep her voice steady. We've been working on it. Together. The payload, Aiden said with obvious pride, contains a very important message. But first we have to have a successful launch, because Serafina says the delivery method is part of the communication. Trevor looked at the elaborate rocket setup, taking in the careful calculations written in Aiden's precise handwriting. The launch pad, constructed from PVC pipe and plywood, the small parachute recovery system that would bring the payload safely back to Earth. Whatever was happening here, it was clearly significant in ways he didn't yet understand. Okay, he said slowly. I'm ready when you are. Aiden beamed and began his pre-launch checklist with the seriousness of a NASA engineer. Wind speed acceptable, recovery area clear, safety distance established. He looked at Serafina. Are you ready for payload deployment? As ready as I'll ever be, she replied, her voice carrying a tremor that had nothing to do with rocket launches. The model rocket was beautiful, a sleek silver creation that stood 3 feet tall and bore hand-painted details that showed weeks of careful work. But it was the nose cone that drew Trevor's attention, the carefully crafted compartment that would carry whatever message Aiden and Serafina had prepared. Countdown commencing, Aiden announced with the kind of dramatic flair that would have made Carl Sagan proud. 10, 9, 8. Serafina reached for Trevor's hand, her fingers trembling slightly as they intertwined with his. Trevor, there's something I need to tell you. 7, 6, 5. I've been thinking about the night we met, about wrong numbers and right choices, and the way life can change in an instant when you're brave enough to answer the call. 4, 3, 2. I've been thinking about what it means to build something real together, something that lasts. 1, ignition. The rocket shot skyward with a satisfying whoosh, trailing smoke and carrying its mysterious payload toward the clear autumn sky. Trevor watched it climb, then arc gracefully before the parachute deployed, bringing it slowly back toward the yard where it landed with a gentle thud in the soft grass near the fence. Aiden whooped with joy and raced toward the landing site, carefully retrieving the nose cone and bringing it back to the picnic table with ceremonial reverence. Perfect flight, he announced. Mission accomplished. Now you can open the payload compartment. Trevor looked at the small capsule that Aiden placed in his hands, then at Serafina, who was watching him with an expression that mixed hope and terror in equal measure. Inside the compartment was a small velvet box and a folded piece of paper covered in Aiden's careful handwriting. The letter first, Serafina said softly. Trevor unfolded the paper and read aloud. Dear Dad, Serafina loves us, and we love her. And she wants to ask you something important, but she's nervous because she's never asked anyone to marry her before. She bought a ring and everything. I think you should say yes, because she makes really good pancakes, and she knows about rockets, and she makes you smile the way Mom used to. Also, she promised that if you say yes, we can build a bigger rocket next time. Love, Aiden. P.S. The ring is in the box. Trevor looked up to find Serafina sliding off the picnic table bench and kneeling in the grass beside him, her coveralls streaked with dirt and her hair escaping from its ponytail, looking nothing like the polished heiress he'd first encountered, and everything like the woman he'd fallen completely in love with. Trevor Stone, she said, her voice steady despite the tears threatening at the corners of her eyes. I know this isn't how these things usually work. I know I'm supposed to wait for you to ask me, but I've spent my whole life waiting for other people to make decisions about my future, and I'm done waiting. She took the ring box from his hands and opened it, revealing a simple platinum band, set with a modest diamond that caught the morning light like a captured star. I don't want a big wedding or a social event or something designed to impress other people. I want a marriage. I want to wake up next to you every morning and fall asleep next to you every night. I want to help Aiden build rockets and teach him about engines and be there when he gets scared during thunderstorms. Trevor found himself holding his breath, aware that this moment would be etched in his memory with the clarity of a photograph, one of those perfect instants that define the before and after of a life. I want to build something real with you, Serafina continued, her voice growing stronger. Not a merger or an arrangement or something that makes sense on paper, but a partnership based on love and respect and the choice to keep choosing each other every day. She paused, swallowing hard, then asked the question that had been building in her heart for weeks. Will you marry me, Trevor? Will you let me be Aiden's stepmother? Will you let me be part of this beautiful life you've built? Trevor looked at her kneeling in his backyard, this woman who had walked away from a fortune to find happiness, who had learned to rebuild engines with the same patience she showed his son, who had somehow fit into their lives like she'd always belonged there. Then he looked at Aiden, who was practically vibrating with excitement and hope. What do you think, buddy? Trevor asked his son. Should I say yes? Dad, Aiden said with the kind of exasperated affection reserved for parents who asked obvious questions. She already lives here. She already makes us pancakes and helps with my homework and reads me stories about space. She's already our family. The wedding is just paperwork, Trevor laughed, a sound full of joy and wonder and gratitude for a life that had turned out better than any dream he'd dared to have. He slipped off the picnic table and knelt in the grass beside Serafina, taking her hands in his. Yes, he said simply. Yes to all of it. To marriage and partnership and building something real together. To being a family in every sense of the word. Serafina's face lit up with relief and joy as she slipped the ring onto his finger, a perfect fit because she'd secretly measured one of his work gloves weeks earlier. Then Trevor pulled her close and kissed her with all the love and promise and certainty he felt, while Aiden cheered and probably half the neighborhood watched from their windows. When they broke apart, still kneeling in the grass with their arms around each other, Aiden threw himself into the group hug with the enthusiasm of a boy who'd just witnessed his two favorite people in the world promise to stay together forever. So when's the wedding? He asked, his voice muffled against their shoulders. Soon, Serafina said, looking at Trevor for confirmation. Small, simple, just family and close friends. Can I be the best man? Aiden asked. You're the only man for the job, Trevor replied, ruffling his son's hair. 3 months later, on a crisp December morning, They gathered in the backyard of the house on Maple Street for a wedding that bore no resemblance to the elaborate ceremony Serafina had fled 8 months earlier. Mrs. Medina had strung lights between the oak trees and prepared enough food to feed the entire neighborhood, which was fortunate because most of the neighborhood had been invited. Father Timothy Ryan from St. Mary's performed the ceremony under the gazebo that Trevor and Chris had built in the garage and assembled the night before. Detective Marco Silva stood as Trevor's best man, while Aidan served as ring bearer, carrying the simple gold bands in a miniature rocket ship that he'd constructed for the occasion. Rosalind Vanderbilt sat in the front row, dabbing at her eyes, with a lace handkerchief and looking happier than anyone had seen her since her husband's death. Beside her, Chris Bartlett held his girlfriend's hand and tried to pretend he wasn't getting emotional, watching his best friend marry the woman who'd somehow completed their little family. The ceremony was brief and heartfelt, focused on promises rather than pageantry. When Father Ryan pronounced them husband and wife, the cheer that went up from the assembled guests could probably be heard 3 blocks away. But the moment that made everyone reach for their tissues came when Serafina knelt down to Aidan's level and made a separate promise to him, to love him, protect him, and be the mother he deserved for as long as she lived. As the sun set over Thornfield and the celebration moved into Mrs. Medina's house for dinner and dancing, Trevor found himself standing at the edge of his backyard, watching his wife, a wife, laugh with his son as they demonstrated proper rocket launch techniques to fascinated wedding guests. "Regrets?" asked a voice behind him. He turned to find Rosalind approaching with 2 glasses of champagne. "None," Trevor said, accepting the drink. "Not a single one." "Good, because I'd hate to think I gave my blessing to the wrong man." Trevor smiled, remembering their first confrontation in this same backyard, when she'd seen him as an obstacle to her daughter's future, rather than the answer to her prayers. "What changed your mind?" "Watching her discover who she really is. Watching her be happy in a way I'd never seen before. Watching you see her for exactly who she is and love her for it." Rosalind sipped her champagne thoughtfully. "You know, her father always said that the best business partnerships were built on mutual respect and shared goals. Turns out the same. And thing applies to marriages. Is that what we are? A good business partnership?" Rosalind laughed, a sound of pure delight. "Trevor, you're the best investment I've ever made. The return on my daughter's happiness alone makes you worth more than any merger Sebastian could have provided." As if summoned by her name, Serafina appeared at Trevor's side, her cheeks flushed from dancing and her eyes bright with joy. She changed from her simple white dress into jeans and a sweater, looking completely at ease and utterly radiant. "What are you two plotting over here?" she asked, sliding her arms around Trevor's waist. "Just discussing the value of good partnerships," Rosalind replied with a smile that held depths of meaning only the 3 of them understood. "Speaking of partnerships," Serafina said, "Aidan wants to know if we can start planning the honeymoon. Rocket launch tomorrow. He has ideas about payload capacity that apparently can't wait." "Of course he does," Trevor said, pulling her closer. "Where does he want to go for the honeymoon? Mars?" He's thinking more practically. "Disney World, with a side trip to Kennedy Space Center. That's my boy, combining fun with educational opportunities." As the evening wound down and the guests began to drift home, filled with Mrs. Medina's cooking and warmed by the celebration of love found in the most unexpected way, Trevor helped Serafina clean up the backyard, while Aidan fell asleep on the couch inside, exhausted from a day of being the center of attention. "Do you ever think about that night?" Serafina asked as they folded chairs and collected champagne glasses scattered around the yard. "About what would have happened if I dialed the right number?" Trevor paused in his work, considering the question seriously. "Sometimes, but I think about something else more often." "What's that?" I think about how there are no wrong numbers, just calls that find their way to exactly where they need to go. Serafina stopped what she was doing and looked at him, her face soft with love. And wonder, that's beautiful, it's true. That call brought you to us, brought us to you, brought all of us to this. He gestured around the backyard, where they'd celebrated their wedding, where Aidan launched rockets and chased fireflies, where they'd built a life that was better than anything any of them had dared to dream. I love you, Trevor Stone, Serafina said, moving into his arms for the 1,000th time that day and somehow making it feel like the first. I love you too, Serafina Stone, he replied, still marveling at how perfectly her new name fit, how naturally she'd become part of everything that mattered to him. Above them the stars wheeled in their ancient patterns, marking time and bearing. Witness to the simple truth that sometimes the most important journeys begin with wrong numbers and end with found families. Sometimes the life you're meant to live is the one you never planned for. And sometimes, if you're brave enough to answer when love calls, you discover that happily ever after isn't a fairy tale ending. It's a choice you make every day to keep building something beautiful together. In the house behind them, Aidan slept, peacefully under his rocket ship mobile, dreaming of Mars colonies and rocket launches, secure in the knowledge that when he woke up, his family would still be there, all of them. Together and on Maple Street, in a modest duplex where love had taken root and grown into something extraordinary, three people who had found each other in the darkness discovered that they could create their own light, bright enough to last a lifetime, strong enough to guide them home. The end. Up next, 2 more incredible stories are waiting for you right on your screen. If you enjoyed this one, you won't want to miss this. Just click to watch. And don't forget to subscribe. It would mean a lot.